Like many other coastal cities around the country, Boston faces mounting pressure to manage the effects of climate change, especially rising sea levels. Local officials have been taking steps to address the problem over the past few years, but there's a new report recommending strategies and possible sources of funding. The report was done by the Sustainable Solutions Lab at UMass Boston. We'd like to welcome the lead author and a professor of management, David Levy. Thank you very much for being with us, David.
Than's very much for inviting me.
One of the main reasons you're here is because of something that happened early March and early January that isn't supposed to happen that frequently. I mean, is this a sign of a big trend that we have to worry about?
Unfortunately, it might be. I mean, you can't read too much into any single weather event, but both of those storms were around the magnitude that we would expect once in 100 years, and we had them back to back. And you saw all the areas that were flooded downtown, in the seaport area, and so there was some significant disruption to business. At UMass Boston, where I work, Morrissey Boulevard is already flooding several times a year from tides, and that's getting more serious. And yes, sea levels are rising, and we're seeing more fierce storms, so we're going to see more of this flooding and extreme precipitation going along with it.
Well, we see this water, washing over areas like Long Wharf in downtown Boston. It looks strange for one day, and then the water recedes. But talk about the kind of money that's being lost during that interim when that comes in there.
Right, there haven't yet been some estimates for Boston about how much that cost, but NOAA, the National Oceans and Atmospheric Administration, last year for 2017 put the cost of weather-related disasters at $306 billion. Nationwide, that's a figure, but that's 40% higher than the prior record from 2005. So the cost is growing. Insurance companies are getting worried about the cost. The cost is damaged buildings, their contents and inventories, damaged infrastructure, disrupted business and disrupted value chains. There are a lot of knock-on effects from these kinds of things. If the tunnels go out, we saw the Blue Line, the aquarium stop was flooded. If the Blue Line goes down, if the tunnel did go out between Boston and East Boston to the airport, we'd see very, very significant disruption. And Boston, of course, is a hub, and it would affect the rest of the region as well.
Well, back when those storms took place in January and March, some of us were looking at social media feeds. We saw the video, and of course the intuitive response is, oh, this is a big problem for people who live in expensive high-rises near the water, but is it really just about them?
It's not just about them. I mean, there's a lot of small businesses that can be affected as well. One of the statistics that comes out of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Association, is that about 40% of businesses affected by major storms like Sandy, Hurricane Sandy, never reopen their doors, and another 25% fail within a year. So more significant flooding has a big effect on small businesses. Homeowners as well. The big high-rises tend to be more resilient, but the people who live in triple-deckers, and they're made out of wood, and all the the siding and gets messed up, the insulation, and a lot of those buildings very quickly develop mold and have to be pulled down. And even with the big buildings, the water gets into the basements, and that tends to be where the electronic equipment, the elevators, the generators, and again, going back to Hurricane Sandy, a lot of these buildings, it took several months for them to be back in operation because so much of their equipment was damaged.
Well, in Boston, with new construction, we've heard some very interesting stories about big projects. The buildings have these features to withstand rising sea levels, but is that the norm, or do we need to see more of that?
Yeah, it's certainly not the norm yet. It only costs a little bit more for new construction, and the example a lot of people like to give is the Spalding Rehab facility, where the ground floor is floodable, right? There's nothing essential there. All the patients are higher up. All the emergency equipment, all the extra generators, that's all higher up. So they're built to withstand a flood, and you can have things on the first floor that's just parking and nothing that's particularly important. GE's new headquarters similarly is being built to withstand significant flooding there. The kind of flooding that we get in Boston, we get high tides that are around the highest one's around 12 feet above the mean low tide, plus another 3 or 4 foot of storm surge in these once in 100-year storms. And that's, you know, the sort of thing that we might be planning for. But as sea levels rise, you know, we're likely to see at least another foot within a decade or two. And that begins to challenge a lot of the existing buildings that haven't been built for this.
So where do you get the money to retrofit them? Or replace them if that's needed?
Yes, it's a problem. New buildings, as I said, it doesn't cost that much more. Retrofitting buildings can be a much bigger deal. And so that comes down to generally private building owners, and they have to be able to see a return on investment. There are some ways to do this, right? So if it can be integrated with, say, energy efficiency upgrades, that can potentially generate more of a revenue stream from savings, reduced fuel costs, and so on. Upgrading buildings to be more resilient will also help save building owners on the insurance perhaps, so that's another revenue stream. But the problem that we're facing is that a lot of these investments are primarily to stop future damage. And so these are new risks. It doesn't necessarily generate a big cash flow. So the business case, you know, isn't super solid necessarily at the building owner level, which is why we're looking at neighborhood level solutions as well.
Give me an example of a neighborhood level solution that you might think of.
So the Barr Foundation, which has been funding a lot of this work, including the Climate Ready Boston report that came out from the city at the end of 2016, and now they're beginning to look at specific neighborhoods. The plan for East Boston and Charlestown has already been published. It's really a preliminary assessment of the damage and a very rough outline of a plan for raising the perimeter, for integrating coastal defenses into the existing shoreline, the existing buildings there, raising some parks, some roads. The project is underway right now for South Boston, and they're going to be looking at the waterfront of the downtown area as well. And beginning to put a price tag on this. You know, for East Boston over the next couple of decades, it's in the sort of maybe 20 to 30, up to maybe 50 million range in order to do what's needed there. For South Boston, it could be several hundred million. It's a much more exposed waterfront and will be much harder to protect. So we're looking at some significant sums here.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Professor David Levy from UMass Boston. Professor, we've heard about one idea quite a bit in Boston, and it goes mostly about let's build a wall out in the harbor someplace, and that'll stop the ocean from coming in. How important is it to fixate on that as opposed to doing something else?
Yes, build that wall as if that's one simple solution is going to solve everything. Yes. No, it's probably not the best idea in the short term. My good colleague Paul Kirshen has been leading a project looking at a harbour barrier, and the results are going to be published fairly soon. First of all, it's going to be very expensive. They haven't got a final figure yet, but somewhere between $7 and $15 billion perhaps. And so that's a lot of money, and it would preempt perhaps money for other projects. It would be, on the order of a big dig type of project, which also suggests it's going to take 20, 30 years to plan, permit, design, build this thing. So we need some shorter term solutions. We've already seen these damaging floods. As I said, within a decade or two, they could be significantly worse. So we need some shorter term solutions. And a related reason why I think that the city is looking to spend the money in the neighborhoods is there's a great opportunity here. It's going to cost money, but maybe the total amount across the different neighborhoods somewhere in the $1 to $2.5 billion range in the short to medium term. But that money can go to improving infrastructure, housing, improving access to transportation. There's an opportunity here to revitalize neighborhoods if you package it together with workforce training, with neighborhood economic development. I think that the opportunities to transform Boston, and particularly some of the vulnerable communities here, are much greater than just building a wall. And one issue with the wall is we don't know yet by what we need to be building for. We don't know if sea level rise toward the end of the century is going to be on the low end 1 to 3 feet, or at the high end potentially 7 to 10 feet. And so, until we know what the parameters of this are. We don't know what kind of wall we should be building, how big it should be, how expensive, what to spend. So there are a lot of good reasons to start locally in the neighborhoods and do this incrementally as we learn more.
I don't see a huge rising tide of government money to bail us out here. So other than that, what are some of the best ideas for getting that money from somewhere else?
Right. It's true, the federal government in the past has spent or has provided a significant chunk of these funds, right? They covered almost all of the $15 billion that was used for upgrading the New Orleans flood defenses. The Big Dig was about 50% federal money, again about $15 billion altogether there. We're figuring we probably won't be getting 50% of whatever the Boston flood defenses are going to cost. But we'll get something, right? FEMA has some programs. NOAA has some programs, the big federal agencies. But I think the state is going to have to step up here. And so some ideas we've been floating are carbon-related revenues and fees. So for example, there already is a cap and trade system in Massachusetts and all the Reggie states, the northeastern states, including New York. Tightening the caps there would generate some more revenue, potentially generating another $100 million a year. The gasoline tax in Massachusetts is particularly low in relation to the region. It's about 26.5 cents. Another nickel on that would raise about another $150 million a year, statewide, not just for Boston, of course. So there are opportunities, and it's for economists, they like to think about tying the revenue to the source of the problem. And it's important to remember, burning fuels, fossil fuels, is the source of the problem. So oil, gasoline, and other forms of fossil fuel-based energy, if we put a small fee on them, it will also help to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases. At the city level, not just Boston, the other cities in the region are going to have to contribute towards this as well. But other cities are facing up to this. I know San Francisco is planning a bond issue of around $350 million. Similarly, Miami in the same kind of range. Cities are realizing that if to preserve the cities, they're going to have to issue bonds. We need to spread the costs out, of course, and try and make it fair and try and build in equity. Fairness means that we tie the payment to the benefits that you get. Equity means more in proportion to the ability to pay. Not everybody is going to be able to afford these, so we need to have some structure that ensures that the people with more ability to pay are also paying more.
We should mention there are a lot more details in the report itself, so if people want to find that, what's the best way to look it up?
If you go to the website of the Sustainable Solutions Lab at UMass Boston, that will probably be the best way. It'll be linked there. It's being officially released on April the 13th, so you'll have to wait a few days before that's out. And we have an event at the UMass Club on April the 13th, if anybody is interested. I'm not sure if it'll be on the city website, the Climate Ready Boston website. This isn't an official report of the city of Boston, but we've been working in quite close collaboration with Boston around these things.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Professor David Levy from UMass Boston.